Take it away, Mike.
Thank you so much. Thank you. Right, everyone hold on to your butts because I don't know where this talk's going or how many of the 68 slides I've written you're going to see. But hello, everyone. I'm Mike. We're not doing this, so don't worry about it. Here's what the paper's claim is. The claim is that game design is generative design. And by generative design, I mean the kinds of things we think about when we build procedural generators. And I think we have a little bit of time for questions. So I just wanted to thank you all for... okay, so turns out that I'm not allowed to just do this, but honestly, like, it was a very difficult paper to write. It's the most rejected paper I've ever written and the most rewritten paper. And I knew it was going to be a hard talk to write, and then I left it to the last minute. So I kind of asked for it. But here's the thing. Game design and generative design seem to be very close to one another. They seem to have a lot of overlapping skill sets and problems. And I was thinking about this, and I was observing it in all these different places. And I was beginning to wonder, like, are they actually just basically the same thing? And what would that mean if they were? What would it tell us? What kind of directions might it must lead us in? I kind of written a paper where I sort of muddled through it and argued that it might help us kind of evaluate why people don't always talk the same language as us when they want to talk about procedural generation. But as I was writing the paper, well, no, this is not. As I was writing the paper, I was like, is this obvious? Like, am I going to write this paper? And everyone's just going to be like, what do you mean? Like, it's like, you know, telling them that Thursday is a day or something. Like, people, but then I got some reviews and they were like, okay, this is definitely not obvious. Is it just wrong? That's the other option. Like, it might just be way off. And I kind of came to the conclusion that, you know, I don't think it's either, but I need a really careful argument to try and make it. And the paper is like my best attempt at doing this so far. It's not perfect. It's a bit messy. And today I'm going to give you some parts of it, but not all of it. I want to talk to you more about sort of motivations and feelings about the paper rather than every single nitty-gritty thing. So in the paper, one of the things I start out by looking at is like, what do we mean when we talk about procedural generation or PCG? And if you look at, say, job sites, what you'll find is that most jobs that use the word procedural are about audio or animation because it has a slightly different contextual meaning. But all the design-related roles are actually technical roles where only design is like a small part of it. It's like, you know, an engineer who does a bit of design of these specific things. So it's like maybe PCG is just a purely technical thing. But then if you look at the GDC Vault, you see talks about procedural content generation in every single track. And books like PCG for Game Design, the chapter authors are mostly credited commercial game designers. So maybe it sort of begins as a technical thing and then spreads out. But then why does it spread in some areas and not others? Why do we understand this in different ways? And so one of the things in the paper I realized is like we need to sort of redefine what we mean by procedural, because when we use it in this room, procedural content generation, it means something different to what everyone else means when they're outside of this room. So one of the things I did in the paper was I surveyed a bunch of people and I said, okay, well, for example, can you give me a bunch of words that come to mind when you talk about procedural content generation? And the top word is random, which is really interesting. And the reason it's interesting is because when we talk about procedural generation, one of the key examples we give is elite. And actually, you know, I don't think it falls under this tighter definition of procedural generation, for example. I think there's something else going on when we talk about a game that uses procedural generation, right? And I'm not saying that we have to change our definitions, but I'm thinking about like, what were the people responding to this survey thinking about? And one of the other things I asked, which I really, really liked, I gave them some games and I said, should this be tagged as procedural generation on Steam? And then I asked them, does it use procedural generation? And some of these games were very obvious. Minecraft, absolutely yes to both questions. Baldur's Gate 3, no one thinks that should be tagged with procedural generation, but 10% of them still think it uses it, and 40% are not sure whether it uses it. So there was all this interesting stuff coming out of the data, and in the paper I kind of suggest that maybe we need this like tighter definition for a subset of procedural generation tech that's actually affecting the gameplay, and it's doing things that it's producing content that the player can't predict, that changes between play sessions, sorry, Elite, and which influences the player's decision making, because that seems to be like a lot of the things that are crucial when people are talking about this phrase. So on the flip side, how do designers feel about this kind of stuff when we talk about it? Like when we ask them how do they feel about procedural generation, what kinds of things do they say? Well, historically, we kind of know that they actually have lots of problems. So this is a talk from 2015 by Grant Duncan. Just before No Man's Sky comes out, he was the art director, I think. And he's talking about like how his art friends feel about procedural generation. And there's just loads of great great quotes. Even in 2015, they just didn't like procedural generation. And this quote here, this line, "Randomness can never lead to good art," is a really interesting quote. Like, it's absolutely a fascinating thing to say, right? And it's not that they're wrong or right, it's just really interesting to hear what their opinions are. And a few years ago, on co-host, there was a sort of a chain of subtweeting that kind of went on because I said a thing about AI that people did not like. And one of these quotes of a quote tweet was by an indie game developer who most of you in the room would know. They had written this thing about how they didn't like AI, but also they didn't even want to play games with procedural generation anymore. And I'm paraphrasing, I couldn't find it on archive, unfortunately, but they basically said they only wanted to play things that had been designed by human hands, designed with care. And I don't think this person is bad or wrong or stupid or any of these things, but I think it's a fascinating thing to say, right? And it's really interesting to think about like why we're saying it. I think we know why we're saying it. This was some stuff happening on Blue Sky this week. The developers of Arc Raiders was like, every games company is using AI now. And a bunch of game developers were like, no, we're not. And some of them were like, actually, every single pixel in our game is placed by hand, which is an interesting thing to say that's almost certainly wrong. But why do we say it? Like, what do we mean? Why are people talking about it? The reason it struck me a lot over the last few years is because I spent a good portion of my career arguing the exact opposite thing, right? Arguing that the reason Spelunky's procedural generator is so beautiful and effective is because Derek Yu has designed it in a way no one else could. Absolutely no one else in this room could build Spelunky's procedural generator because it involves a bunch of his design knowledge and style and aesthetics. So in a way, I was arguing the exact opposite. I was arguing that these things are designed by hand and through a lot of care. And the more I thought about it, it was, isn't most game design about unpredictability? And I don't just mean games with like cards and dice in. I just mean like all games, right? Because they have these like chaotic things called players that go through them. And they're designed to sort of hopefully corral them into certain things. And they're constantly fighting this thing. There's an achievement in the game Tactical Breach Wizards that I believe I'm partly responsible for, because when I was testing the game, the developer left the room and I just completely missed the cue that you were supposed to resurrect this character and use them to solve a puzzle. And he came back an hour later and I was still on the level trying to complete it. And it turns out it is possible, but like, why would you expect someone to do this? The achievement is called the needlessly hard way, because there was really like, and actually, isn't this the famous thing about game design, right? Like, I included this after the keynote. Thank you so much. That was perfect. But like, the one thing we know about game design is that you build these like, best of intentions, and you want these things to happen, and then these absolute gremlins called human beings come along, and none of it matters anymore, right? So that's kind of interesting. Then in the paper, we start talking about like input and output randomness. So if you've not come across these terms before, they're terms which only arrived, I think, in game design discourse in kind of the 2010s, but they predate it. But input randomness is, randomness that arrives when I'm about to do something, make a decision, like something random that affects the state, like drawing a card from a deck. I don't know what that card's going to be. It's randomness that affects the decision I'm going to make. And then there's output randomness. When I say decide I'm going to attack a monster in D&D, I roll a dice. And that dice affects whether the outcome actually happens or how it happens. That's output randomness. And I talk a little bit in the paper about the relationship between this and procedural generation, because the guy that kind of popularized this term, at least in the modern era, is Keith Burgoon. And he actually says people often use the term procedural generation to refer to input randomness, which is really fascinating. He's not saying the two are the same thing. But then you start thinking like, that's weird, because like drawing a card from a deck is not considered procedural generation, but it is an example of input randomness. So are they actually different? And what's the difference between input and output randomness? Because if I'm playing D&D, the output randomness of this person to my right is my input randomness, and what I decide to do has an effect on the game state that the next person is going to decide. And so outputs and inputs are kind of combined. They're combined even if you're playing a single player game, because the decisions I make on one turn affect what might happen next turn. And so all of these things seem completely connected together. And in the paper, there's this section which was the least popular with reviewers on every iteration of the paper. I'm sure some of you in the room, I love you very much, and the feedback was genuinely helpful. I just felt like I couldn't make it work. But there's this lovely series of explanations of opening a treasure chest and how the game designer can adjust this. And I show some examples of like designing this treasure chest to be more handcrafted and to think about player psychology, and also to introduce procedural generation and introduce unpredictability, and how those two things are kind of very similar. And even in these situations, there's all of these things that we can't control, right? And so we don't know if the player is tired, if they're not paying attention, if a 3-year-old has picked up the controller, if there is a speedrunner playing the game. So it really, even in the most static, unchanging thing that we can put in a game, none of us know what's going to happen as soon as someone picks up a controller. So just for 1 minute, I'm going to go through this like meaty diagram that's like big part of the paper. Basically, I argue that game designs are a combination of two things. There's some situation that's happening, right, in the game. And we've got things that we can control, the game systems, the stuff that we put in place up until this point, things like the fact that a health system is in the game at all. Then there's stuff that we can't control. This is things that the player has done up to this point. Maybe they just kept repeatedly running into spike traps over and over, and they've arrived at this game state with 1 HP. And then what we have is like situations that we think this game state is going to lead to, right? We're imagining like, oh, they might open this chest and get some gold, and that'll be a fairly average output. Or they might open the chest while they're almost dead, and they might find a health potion inside, and that would be really cool. And there's like a space of outputs that we're imagining might be caused by this game state. And then in reality, there's a bunch of stuff that we couldn't predict have happened. Like someone picks up the chest and they throw it in the fire because they just played Dark Souls and they think there are mimics in this game, and there aren't really. And why would you do that? But we can't help it. And when we're designing a procedural generator, we have things that we can control, sliders, grammar shapes, and things like that. We also have some source that we can't control, but we can model, our randomness, maybe a noise field, just a random number generator. We're feeding this through a procedure that we've designed, and we're thinking about things that might come out of it. So Graham Ritchie calls this the inspiring set. So when we're designing a procedural generator, we maybe got in mind a few things that we would definitely like it to be able to generate. And what we're basically doing is we're imagining what the generative space of this thing might be. And then in reality, it's not, because there's a bunch of stuff that it's generating that we wish it wasn't. And so in the paper, I kind of argue why these two things are similar, the ways in which they're similar, and you can read the paper and tell me whether you agree or not. But the more I think about this stuff, the more I see like all of this evidence that there's so much overlap between these two modes of thinking. And earlier this week, Sam Shields was presenting work about play trace arc search. And he put up this slide with like all of these play traces of players, but it just looks like a generative space, right? Like it looks like you've run a generator a bunch of times, and this is the expressive range analysis of what this generator was able to produce, and we're now like trying to filter through it to figure out what the behavior is, but it's not. These are players, these are play testers. But actually, when you think about like playtesting is like expressive range analysis for gameplay traces, right? And so when you are choosing playtesters, you're kind of hoping that the distribution of human behaviors that your playtesters represent is maybe close to your audience, or maybe it models part of an audience, or maybe it doesn't because you chose the wrong random number generator and you only picked playtesters from your studio, or they were all men, or they were all from like, downtown London. And that's not showing the different ways that players behave in other contexts. So I think there's all of these interesting overlaps. And I think one of the reasons why there is a difference is that game designers are human, and they feel like there's this feeling that you can beat the house because I'm a human, so I know how humans think. And so humans aren't random. They're not an RNG system. But actually, in practice, I think most of the time we're wrong, because humans are bad at understanding how they behave. So what are the implications of this? This is okay, fine, Mike. They're the same thing. It's great. Please get off the stage. Well, I think there's a couple of things. If we share problems, if we're thinking about the same things, then that might mean that we share the same solutions as well. So maybe expressive range analysis works really well on game design problems. There's actually some evidence, things like magic deck construction. This is a site called Moxfield. If you design a magic deck, it will basically do an expressive range analysis of your magic deck. And in the paper, I do a similar thing where I take 2 decks from a game called Slay the Spire, one of which lost and one of which won on the final level of the hardest way to play the game. And I point out that if you do an ERA of like all of the you draw hands like hundreds of times and you plot them on here, the losing deck kind of didn't have enough block. It went too far into aggression. Like, I think, there are ways that we can share like different approaches and ways of thinking about our problems. The second thing in the paper, which is a bit more conceptual maybe, is like rethinking how we think about play and thinking about it more as space exploration instead. So in the paper, an example I give is that the first time you play Mario and the first time you play Spelunky, they are equally procedural experiences. Spelunky is only a procedurally generated game the second time you play it. As far as you're aware, when you start playing Super Mario, maybe it is a PCG game. Maybe the second time you play it, 1-1's not going to look like this, right? And that's partly because there's kind of like a third thing that we haven't considered here. Like I've got the sort of the two designers of those games, and I've talked a lot about designers in this talk, but actually there's the third factor, which is that the person playing your game, I took this photo on the back row, it's not, it's not my best. As they're playing the game, every time they play the game, they get an extra data point of what is possible in the game. And you might argue that, for some games, that is easier to do than others. Maybe 200 times playing Mario 1-1, you've got a pretty good idea of what Mario 1-1 looks like. You think you've built up your generative space of possibilities. We think of roguelikes as games that can surprise us, but we know very well that any game can surprise us, right? And, there are weird things in Super Mario Brothers. Did you know that chain chomps will break free of their chains after 95 seconds? Like, I didn't. And there's way more obscure things like this. And if you want an example of where that can happen, we had a paper about speedrunning in Exag, and that's a place that kind of thing happens all the time. The final thing, and this is the end, is that I think that it might be an opportunity to sort of begin to heal some of these rifts and find ways to speak each other's language again. I talked a bit earlier about people's feelings about procedural generation and wanting to make things that are made by human hands. And I'd love to be able to find a way to sort of change the way we talk about this stuff and realize how much care and interest goes into it. And I'll just leave you with this amazing tweet by John Perry. This was after I'd written this version of the paper, and then he just kind of tweets it out. Very famous game designer I love very much, and he just says, yeah, game design is about corralling uncertainty. Like, you said it, buddy. So thank you so much for listening, and if you've got any questions, I've got a couple of minutes.
I've got one to start things off. Your title has is. Does that mean they're equivalent, or is one subset of the other?
Yeah, I think they're equivalent. I almost wrote the title both ways, and it just felt like a bit clunky. And I think this is actually my least, like, normally my papers have like stupid puns in the title and stuff like that. But yeah, I just wanted like simplicity. But I think they are equivalent, I think, or for all intents and purposes here. Yeah. Yeah, I do put a bit more of that in the paper. I'm going to dodge that question, and we should talk about it at a break. Because also my definitions of, for example, game design are extremely loose, and I don't think most people would like them. But also my brain is like firing so much that I couldn't articulate it properly. But I would love to answer that question later, so do come and let's have a chat. Yeah, sorry, that's a terrible cop-out. Matthew.
So it is true, down this a little bit, and he's frustrated. What do you think?
I think we need like what I personally would like to do, and I don't know, maybe again this is obvious, but like I want to go back over like what are all of the rules of thumb game designers use? What are all of the weird GDC talks that I didn't necessarily watch because I didn't think they were relevant to my work, right? What if I rewatch them now in this new context? And I've been talking to some people this week about something called strategic headroom, which is a fascinating thing, which I've cited and told about before. Fascinating game design idea that then I realized it is about procedural generation. So I think the first of all is to like go back into the archives and like what are all of the things that we didn't even think might be applicable, going both ways, and then maybe test them out. Like I want to see what ERA can do applied to like all these weird game design tasks, for example. Back. So this partly links back to the question I didn't answer, but one of the things I feel like is that both game design and generated design is always incomplete, right? By definition, and actually so is playing games. And so I do think that we need more of that stuff, and that just doing more kind of thinking about spaces in general, right? Thinking about spaces is like the most interesting skill, in my opinion, in procedural content generation. And I think designers do it as well, but we need to talk. And so that we're all like thinking about like, what are the other ways in which this applies? And where are we not applying it? So yeah, I mean, I do think that there's more of that stuff on the horizon. I hope that answers your question. I'm not sure. Yeah, okay. All right.